NFV is the real business case for SDN. So it's going to be a little bit of a different talk from what you've been hearing. I'm not going to be talking about products. I'm not going to be talking about architectures. I'm going to be talking more about approaches and where we are in the industry. So hopefully from this you'll take something away and we can make something happen. There are open issues we need to work on. So, oh, this is the laser pointer. I should be holding my clicker. So I like to use this scenario. I've used it before as a way to explain this. But you've been hearing more about these kinds of examples before. For example, in Margaret Chiosi's talk earlier, she listed a whole set of base use cases. And if you go through them, this is perhaps one example from there which makes the case. So suppose you have, not getting into what the functions are, what you're trying to do here, but I'll take beer as an example. You have customers accessing internet services through a subscriber management element, the BRAS element there, but this is running virtually, so it's a virtual BRAS running in Central Office 1. And there's an orchestration system which has a domain of control of a couple of central offices. And now I have a failure of that whole system in that first central office. So great, the orchestration system can understand what's going on, see that it has resources in another central office, and switch, turn on the BRAS services there. The question is, how do you know that there's reachability from the customers who are accessing that device to that other central office? The orchestrator has no knowledge of the underlay. So somebody needs to do this. And typically we think of an SDN controller as something which has knowledge of the network below and is able to set up the paths. But should it be doing this independently? And does the orchestrator need to know that there's reachability to certain central offices, but not to others, perhaps, and it needs to establish things in a particular place? So this gives you an example of, first of all, the reason SDN is important for NFV. You need to move the network with the function. And secondly, these two need to communicate in some way. And that's why the theme of my talk is, how do these cooperate? Is it going to be competitive? Is it going to be a cacophony? Or is it going to be harmony? Will they work together? So stepping back, just to recap in a very summarized way, what is NFV? What is SDN? Obviously, NFV is initially about the virtualization of network functions, but eventually it's making the network function more, a network infrastructure more cloud-like. And SDN is about dynamic programmability of the network, right? And being able to do things in a service-aware manner, right? Independent of what protocol you use, what controller you use, how the mechanisms, this is fundamentally what you're trying to do with things called SDN. And so I've talked about the fact that NFV is the use case for SDN, but the problem is when you introduce virtualization and you look at what you're doing from a network perspective, you start to introduce several layers of networks and switching. There's switching happening in the software, there's switching happening in physical switches below, there are NICs involved, there are many layers of network involved here. And so you need a way to be able to, I'll use the term, orchestrate these in a way that is synergistic. So we need a holistic view of SDN and NFV. Now I'm going to step back a bit and say, how should we think about SDN? Whenever I think about these things, I try to put some structure around it and try to understand where are we in the industry. So we've done this with NFV. I've talked about it in other places. So we think of NFV as having 4 stages: decouple, virtualize, cloudify, and decompose. So today I'm going to talk about a similar attempt at understanding where we are with SDN. So the early phases of SDN is just simple decoupling of the control from the forwarding and implementing things in software. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these. The next level is now we start to interconnect islands, and we start to give some really application-aware capability. And that's sort of where we are with SDN. But the real value comes from the cloudification phase, where you really integrate the cloud and the network together and take care of all those network layers I was talking about. And the final phase is when you start to decompose things you've built, these monolithic controllers which do everything. I know we've talked about multiple controllers, and I believe we will have multiple controllers, as, for example, Margaret mentioned earlier. But even those individual controllers club a lot of functions together with them. And I believe that last phase of breaking those into microservices and being able to compose and recompose them in different ways is the true goal of our industry. That's where we need to go to really make all these come together. And when we talk about these phases, it's not intended to say that these are hard and fast boundaries and one ends and another starts. These are all sort of an attempt to identify as an average or where the momentum in the industry is at a particular time. And each of these stages of capability give you some advantages, but as you get to more and more, you get the full benefit of SDN and in similar way, NFV. And in terms of, some people ask, well, is this how you deploy? You start this way and go to the next and that. Not true. You can start the deployment depending on where the technology is, where your own business is at any place. What you have to identify is what kind of benefits are you looking for, and does that phase give you the right benefits? If you're looking for things which really need the cloudify layer starting earlier, perhaps you can play with it, but it won't give you the benefits you need. So that's the way to think about this as a way of framing the business problem and relating it to the capabilities. So let me say a little bit more about each of these things. So decouple is essentially, now I have the control plane separated from the hardware. I implement some standard protocol between these, OpenFlow, for example. I implement some forwarding plane in software. I have vSwitches, things like that. But essentially here you're building islands of programmable domains, and you have controllers which control that. And the benefits here, you start to get some application-aware programmability for those domains. You start to get simpler management capabilities for some reasonably small networks. So this is very useful in campus and data center kind of networking, small data centers. The next phase is where you start to do things which allow you to interconnect various things. So at one level, you're able to now do things like chaining. So you're connecting functions together. You're able to add other application-friendly tools, topology management, monitoring and visualization of what the network is doing. And you start to interconnect controller domains. So you talk about federation of controllers. And you interconnect at the data plane layer the underlays and the overlay. At this stage, you might have some limited control plane capability between these. So this is where you start to get the benefits of network programmability. You start to get the benefits of using a policy-based control of the network. And this is, I think, where we are today. People are working on controller federations. Obviously, some of the tools here and the capabilities are emerging. We still haven't really figured out the business between the underlay and the overlay, but that's going to come. So this is, I think, where we are at this stage in our journey. This phase, the next phase, which we call Cloudify, is really the place where you start to get the true benefits, I think, from these approaches. So this is where you're going to base most of your interfaces, especially down from the applications, down from the functions themselves, to be purely policy-based. This is where you will have state visibility between what's happening in the cloud, what's happening in the network. There has to be some visibility of state, which relates to the SLAs you want to offer. And between the network layers, overlay, underlay, and the various layers in between, you have to have some, again, similar state awareness and integration. And this is where you can start to now automate policy-based network behavior, and you can do an integrated orchestration of network and cloud resources. So this is where I think we need to get very quickly to get really all the benefits of our whole SDN NFV journey. And finally, the last phase of things, when you look at it this way, is when you allow the individual building blocks of the controllers to be independently consumable services, so that at the higher layers I can now compose services from cloud resources, from network resources, and build those, stitch those together into services. This is where you get true control plane and data plane integration between the network layers. This is where you're able to compose services at different layers. This is where the true platform as a service goal becomes real. Yes, you can do things in earlier phases in a limited way, but here you truly expose the capabilities of the network to apps. This is where you get to the network app store. That is now, I don't need the network providers and the service providers to be creating the services and the apps. They're creating the platform which enables anyone to come in and create an app on the network. That's really, I think, the holy grail of where we want to really get to. And this is where you can really get innovative services, rapid delivery of services, be able to seamlessly provide the services to the users, and the users don't need to worry about the resources, the resource management, what's happening in the network. It's all transparent. It's done for them by these platform as a service capabilities, by the composed service you have created from these capabilities. So when you look at these four stages and you think of the applicability to NFV, the first phase of decoupling is interesting, but not really very useful to NFV. Once you start to get to the interconnect phase, now you can do some interesting things. You can do use cases like the mobility kind of GI LAN kind of functions. You can start to do virtual CPE kind of functions. But to truly gain the value of this for NFV, when you get to more complicated use cases like virtual EPCs or by actually instantiating mobile virtual network operators, that requires the Cloudify phase. And again, I should clarify that you can always do some of these use cases in an earlier phase. It just takes more work. It takes more work. You have to do a lot of things at the application layer. You have to do a lot more things at the service layer. It's not intrinsic. It's not natural. When you get to the Cloudify stage, that's where a lot of those capabilities are embedded in the infrastructure, and you're able to do these much better, much faster. And finally, when you get to yet more complicated cases like virtual RAN, and again, truly trying to optimize RAN performance with the cloud resources, there, I think you really need the decompose phase. And again, people are doing virtual RAN now, of course, with what we have today, but it takes a lot of work. So I'd like to put this in context together with NFV. As I mentioned, that we look at NFV also as following a similar journey of decouple, virtualize, cloudify, decompose. But the fact of the matter is, though SDN has been around for a while, it's been stuck in this decouple phase for a bit too long. And we're starting now to get into this interconnect phase. NFV, though it sort of started later, it's rapidly moved into the cloudification stage. We are starting to see people building stuff, people working on things, actually starting to deploy things which are in this early cloudify stage. While for the SDN capabilities we have, I think we're still solidly in this interconnect phase. We haven't really resolved all of those things. So what we really need to do is to accelerate this convergence and make a concerted effort to move the SDN capabilities into the cloudify phase quicker, and so that we can get the NFV SDN synergies. And I believe projects like OpenDaylight are key and critical to doing this. If we can concentrate on the right things we're doing there, we can actually get to this faster. Because the frameworks are there, the philosophy is there, the way we've built the OpenDaylight framework is supportive of this. It's just that we need to work on the right things. So, I'll just skip through this. This is something you already know, I think. We're sort of here, we're working on dynamic establishment of the overlay connectivity. Sometimes they're underlay, but they're not really connected. They're sort of independent. Clearly, we have overlay networks. We're starting to do programmability of the overlays. But here's where we need more work to really get to state awareness. What kind of information do you need between the underlay and the overlay? And how do I integrate or interoperate controllers and orchestrators? They need to be in a hierarchy and a federation, I believe. And so, if you've noticed in some of the presentations this morning and yesterday, depending on where the person was coming from, they had a different view of how these fit together. Typically, if you come from a view of somebody working heavily in OpenStack and virtualization, they'll present the whole orchestration and virtualization infrastructure and have network at the bottom underneath Neutron somewhere there. If you look at someone's coming from a network operator, you'll see all these controllers at various levels, and then the cloud resource management is off the side and at the bottom there. I believe there's room for all of these models and more, and we should build controllers and orchestrators in a way that they can support all these models. We shouldn't be thinking of one kind of approach that is, okay, networking belongs to Neutron, everything else is under it. We shouldn't be thinking, oh, the controller knows everything about the network and about the whole infrastructure, I'll use that word, and it's the master. I think there's room for places where they have to cooperate. They have individual domains of visibility. They will overlap perhaps, but I don't think in most cases you'll get to a place, especially when we try to do this throughout the infrastructure and not in certain parts, So I don't believe that you'll have a place where you can have one as a master and one as a slave. These two have to cooperate and have to inform each other. And so my request to you is, as you design these things, think of them as independent but cooperative entities. There's going to be a need for request for functionality or request for action and response. There's going to be need for information. For example, the underlay may need to inform the orchestrator that there's a connectivity problem here, or there's a problem in terms of meeting the SLA, and then let the orchestrator take the decision it needs to do. And I'd say let's focus on intent, policy, and SLA-based abstractions above. Let's hide the complexity of the network below and try to unify on a common set of intent and policy-based interfaces. And let's keep the core controller infrastructure, for example, in Daylight, to be where the intelligence and the models are. And let's not fragment or delegate those into the underlying plugins, because that unified model and the unified service layer is where the value of all this comes from. If we can keep that and abstract those capabilities away for the applications into a policy-based infrastructure, I think we'll achieve the harmony we're looking for. Thank you.